All right, everyone. This is the mechanisms of evolution. Um, so our essential question is, how do populations respond to changes in their environment? And this is my dad. No, it's not really. This is Darwin. So he wrote The Origin of Species, and he was not the. There's a lot of controversy. He was working with a gentleman called Robert Wallace, and they were exchanging information back and forth about evolution. But Darwin was the first one that had the published, so he gets credit for it, which is whatever. Anyway, all right. So we're going to first we talk about this quite a bit. So evolution is a process by which modern species have descended from common ancient ancestors. Right? It's based on how patterns and such changes over time arise. And so we've talked about that extensively, how, like for instance, we didn't come from monkeys, right? We have common ancestors. It's not improvement. So there's no goal of evolution. The environment always changes. So, we're not going anywhere in particular. It's, an very dynamic, always changing process. And then again, we talked about a few weeks ago how it's not a belief system. This is based on scientific facts and evidence. So it's not we're just not a higher authority is saying, hey, evolution has occurred, and we're expecting you just to believe it. It's not. We have evidence, and so it is a scientific theory. And then again, it happens to populations and not individuals. So when we talk about evolution, we talk about um, the basic definition is the change over time. But when we're talking about populations or organisms, we're talking about how the change of the relative frequency of alleles in a population. So, and we really haven't talked a lot about alleles. We'll explain what those are, and we'll explain a little bit more. So if there's no allele change, there's no evolution, and we'll sort of explain what that is. All right. So first we'll go with the definition of a population is a group of individuals of the same species living together in the same area. Okay. And we talk about a community would be a group of populations. An ecosystem would be not only the community plus the abiotic factors, right? So what are alleles? So alleles are various forms of a trait or a gene that may appear in a population, right? So, for instance, parents pass down their alleles or their traits to their offspring through asexual or sexual reproduction. We mostly talk about sexual reproduction when we're talking about higher order organisms like humans and mammals and insects and things like that. Organisms can only pass down the alleles or the traits that they have. Asexual reproduction only has one parent, so all their alleles get passed down to their offspring. All right. So each individual has two alleles for a trait. So for instance, I talked about my earlobes. All right. So I have a set of genes from mom and I have a set of genes from my dad. Now, the gene that talks about the attachment of their earlobe, I have one gene that's coded for my mom and one gene that's coded for my dad. Those are alleles, the form of a gene. That's what an allele is, so the form of a gene. So for me, there's a form of a gene that is there for attached earlobes, and there's a form of a gene for unattached or the free earlobes. Now, both of my parents had the allele, they passed on their allele for attached earlobes. And that's why I have attached, because both of my parents had it, and it just tends to be a recessive allele. So that's why I have attached earlobes, right? So in sexual reproduction, each parent gives one allele for their offspring, right? So I got one for my mom and I got one for my dad. Sexual reproduction increases the variation within a population with more combinations of alleles. And you can sort of make sense of that. I think one of the biggest examples would be eye color, right? So there's so many different combinations of alleles with eye colors that the way that they're blended, we get different color eyes, right? And when we talk about genetics, and we'll talk about genetics more when we get into that unit, is this humans are too complicated. It's not necessarily a yes or no thing. All right, so a gene pool, if you have all the alleles that are present in a population, that's the genes. That's a gene pool. All right, so if you count up all the alleles for flower color, the yellow alleles and the red alleles, and you count them all up for this flower, all these flowers here, that's the gene pool. All right, all the alleles in a population of organisms that can breed with each other. The frequency is how often that allele appears in a population's gene pool. So it's usually represented by a percentage. So let's say if I go back to this picture, just sort of go here, right? So let's say in this population, 75, if I have 1,000 alleles, right? So that means I have 500 flowers because each flower has 2 alleles. If I have 1,000 alleles and 750 of those 1,000 are the yellow and 250 are the red, that means the allele frequency for the yellow would be 75%, right? Because it's 75% of those 1,000 alleles are yellow. All right, so now evolution is a change in a population's allele frequency, right? So I'll go back to this picture. So let's say over a period of time, and for whatever reason, right, we were at 75% of the red flowers or yellow flowers, sorry. And then let's say we come back to the same field 100 years later, and now I have 50% of my alleles are yellow, 50% of my alleles are red. Evolution happened, right? Because we went from a 75% yellow down to a 50% yellow. So that's evolution, right? The allele frequency changed over time. Okay. And, we can see here, it goes through the allele frequency. So we have 50% brown, 50% white. Here we have 70% brown, 30% white. And here we have 100% brown and 0% white. And so you can see that evolution occurred, right, through these generations. All right, so we're going to do the 5 fingers of evolution, right? And if you want to, you can draw, we usually did that before, we drew a hand. We had you guys draw a hand on your notes. So this is a review because we did this in our warm-up. So pinky, a small population size. So populations constraint. So with that, again, the fewer amount of alleles that you have in a population, the more able evolution is to happen, right? And that continue to all the different things. Ring finger, non-random mating. Individuals choose a mate based on preference or location. So again, what traits do they have? Are they going to pick the traits that are going to help the species survive? The middle finger, mutation. So we have different mutations added. All right, or new genes added, I mean. And then we have our pointer finger, movement. So we have immigration, which is organisms coming into a population, or emigration, organisms leaving a population. So that's, that's the gene flow, right? So you have new genes coming in, new genes leaving. And I think I explained, like with the finches, right? We started out with one species of finch, and then over time, you can imagine like the first species coming and they're starting to populate and then it gets really crowded and there's not enough resources. And so what's going to happen is those finches will move maybe to a different area. And then over time, they'll evolve and eventually become a new species, maybe, right? So we started out with one species on those islands. Now there's like 13, right? So that's movement, immigration, and immigration. And then the last thing we talked about is natural selection, allowing for adaptations, organisms that have have the traits that are best suited to their environment are able to survive and then reproduce. Okay, so that's natural selection. All right. Okay, so that is it. And we'll go over these notes again in class because I know allele frequency is a little bit tricky. We don't ever have you um, calculate it. So we just need for you to understand the concept of allele frequency. Oh, I do have more, I guess. Sorry. All right, so natural selection means that organisms with the traits best suited to their environment are more likely to survive and reproduce. This is the development and adaptations, and we did that in our warm-up. All right, so it is survival of the fittest. I think we've heard that term. It's a biological term. Fitness is a biological term, meaning that they have the traits that are best suited for the environment. Adaptations are inherited traits that increases an organism's chance of survival. So adaptations are passed on from generation to generation, and so it's changes in those traits that help increase the chance of survival. All right. So so a big thing is an organism must already have that trait for it to be selected for, right? So and that's where we start talking about how mutations are, we first considered them to be random, but there might be some evidence where they're not necessarily random, right? And that's sort of a tricky thing to think about, right? So an organism cannot choose to have a trait in order to survive in an environment, right? We can't choose to have wings if it gets so populated we want to live in the sky, right? So it has to already have that genetic, the alleles, it already has to be there, all right? Populations with a greater variation are more likely going to be able to survive um, um, than other populations, right? So they're more likely that some individuals will have the trait to allow them to survive when there are changes to their environment, right? So that's when we start talking about asexual versus sexual reproduction. The sexual reproduction allows for more variation within a population or within an environment, right? So if the environment changes, there's a chance that some of the population will already have a trait that's suited for that change in the environment. So natural selection and whoops. Yeah, so that's the natural selection, right? So the orange beetles will eventually increase in population because the birds don't like them. So go ahead. This is that pocket rock pocket mouse video. I can't show it here because I'm sharing my screen and the sound comes, but it's a very, very fascinating video, and I might even show it in class because I love it. I just it's one of my favorites because it just shows in a nutshell evolution within a short period of time, and I enjoy it. So anyway, so those are the notes, and we'll see you in class.